I expect that everybody will have climate resilience, climate mitigation as part of their role. Some people need to be experts, but sometimes we need people that just go, okay, no, the business case doesn't have a climate resilience contribution. They need to have the step that just allows them to say, no, go back and do a bit more work. I think in the future, everyone will be playing a part if they're not already.
Penny Joseph is the head of climate resilience at the major electricity distributor, Ausgrid. Her current job title didn't even exist when she entered the workforce. So how did Penny build the skill set to be a climate leader in an industry at the coalface of managing climate change? I'm Dr Juliet Bourke, and this is The Business Of, a podcast from the University of New South Wales Business School. Adapting to climate change is a top priority for most industries today, and that means new roles are being introduced all the time. In practice, workers and leaders are combining their existing skills with a whole range of new ones, most of which they'll have to learn on the fly. So what does work look like for Penny? And what can she teach us about creating huge change in a long-standing industry like the energy sector? And what does true climate resilience look like in a business?
Resilience means to me that we've thought through the risks of the future and have strategies in place that allow us to be prepared for that. So there's two aspects. One is dealing with the question of risk, which is thinking about, what are the things that are likely to impact us and then what would be the consequence of those things. But I like to go further when I think about the question of resilience, because resilience is also being prepared for things you might not know about or might not expect to happen. And so one of the things that I like to do is to make sure that we've got lots of options available so that if things hit you in a way that you didn't expect, that you've got, multiple pathways that you can decide to go down.
Someone once described options to me as having a full menu as opposed to a sort of curated degustation menu, where your options are already within a limited bound. How do you think about options? How do you imagine the future in so many options?
So some decisions that you make open up more options, and some decisions that you make close down options. So that way you're on this pathway forevermore. So if you can make decisions that open up options, then, in the future, when things change or things didn't work out exactly like you planned, then, you've got lots of options in terms of the way that you might progress. It's not dissimilar to deciding on a career path, for example. My daughter is going through choosing a career at the moment, and you think, some choices will lock you into particular pathways and some choices will, enable you to be sort of very open to a lot of opportunities. And so it's just similar to that and doing that in a business sense.
So let's just bring that down to, what does that look like, a day in the life of Penny Joseph? How do you bring that down to Tuesday?
Well, at the moment we are working through a regulatory proposal. So the electricity industry is regulated by the Australian Energy Regulator, and so at the moment we're planning a 5-year submission that we'll put as a proposal for the regulator. So this week I've got 3 rounds of community engagements happening to understand the goals of the community, but also we'll be working with a climate risk expert. So today I'll be working with, an organisation that's helping us through the climate risks. And for us, those risks are mostly heat, particularly up in the Hunter Valley, bushfire, and particularly windstorms in the coastal areas because they, cause the infrastructure to be impacted. So we'll be working, this week with climate experts and then obviously engineering experts. So how do you take that risk view and then sort of bring it back to what does that mean for the infrastructure? What does it mean for a prudent investment? And then, of course, thinking about today, also working with economists. So, how do you build business cases for that in a way that, you can demonstrate that the investment is prudent use of bill payers' money.
So you talked before, Penny, about stakeholder engagement. And I'm wondering, how do you bring people to the table and then when they're at the table, align them? Because obviously people have very different interests and very different perspectives if, as you say, there are many different options to create resilience. How do you do that?
Great question. In terms of the ecosystem for resilience, it's actually really quite well established. And so you have the traditional sort of emergency services that have their collaborations, and then you have a lot of emerging collaborations. So there's a lot of people that play the curator of those. So, for example, the Committee for Sydney is bringing in a whole lot of collaborations to solve for some problems. There's an Urban Heat Task Force that's bringing together people to look at the urban heat problem, and so sometimes I think actually we're not short of collaborations. We sometimes may need a collaborator to collaborate the collaborators, but it's very helpful because I think the thing is that people are all wanting to solve problems, and the people that come into the resilience space, they tend to be very community-minded. Where it gets challenging is that they're coming to the table with a different set of expectations. They're coming with different sets of resources, and sometimes regulations that impact the way or the role that they can contribute. We need to be able to work collectively through those issues so that you can get solutions that work for everybody.
Well, that sounds like a challenge, actually. To me, that doesn't sound like all sort of roses and sunshine. So how do you approach something like that? It's very ambiguous, and I know you've got a policy framework around it, and I know you've got a pragmatic mindset, but what's your step to sort of moving the beast along the path?
I think that's really important point, is that sometimes you're not necessarily trying to solve the problem completely, but just to move it forward. And so one of the things that we are able to do is to really understand the data that can allow you to articulate the role that you can play or the impacts that you are going to have. For example, a topic like heat is like what is the impact that heat's going to have on us? What's the impact that the heat is going to have on customers? What's the role that they're expecting us to play, or the regulatory framework's expecting us to play in that type of scenario? And so if you can gather the data of, understanding what are those impacts, then you can start to create a much better economic case for being able to kind of move the dial. And also, obviously, you can experiment and, you can find methods that work. But also, if you've got sort of the evidence case behind you, then you can, sort of challenge manufacturers, or you can challenge the supply chain to sort of come on board with what it is that you're trying to do. But it is hard because often you need to make decisions in a time frame where you haven't received all of that data. And so you really do need to be able to also assess what's the kind of best thing given the information that I have. And I think the best leaders are making good decisions with incomplete information.
Penny, what are the big challenges that you're facing at Ausgrid?
Yeah, one of the challenges is aligning timeframes. And so what I mean by that is a whole lot of evidence that you're trying to produce. You have a whole lot of community sentiment that you're trying to garner, but having to do that in the milestones of like the regulatory process. So what that means is for us is that when we go through the regulatory process, we're sort of putting a proposal for 5 years. And so you really need to be quite planned about the things that you're trying to achieve in the 5-year interval. And so there's really good reasons for that, and that's worked really well in the past. But what I would like to be able to establish is the conditions that enable us to be more adaptive, so that as new information comes on board, that we're able to sort of respond to those changing items and be able to change and adapt the strategies that we have as potential solutions become more informed with information. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to produce is processes that allow us to be more adaptive in the approach that we take.
And I imagine adaptation is a key principle of resilience, right? So you're sort of building in resilience to your own processes.
Yeah.
Is that?
Well, that's right, because you should be able to think, okay, well, this is a great solution. thinking that this is going to be really effective. But, if you started down that pathway and you had a big event and it didn't work or the community didn't like it anymore, then you should be able to sort of take that new information and respond to it and keep going. You might strengthen the same solution, or you might decide to do something quite differently, or you might decide to do more of it. Perhaps it works really well. So you just need to build in the assurance processes that allow you to take stock and make good informed decisions.
I like the way you keep on bringing me back to this, don't you? I keep on making it sort of big and catastrophizing and you're like, no, it's just a simple step. You got your Gantt chart, you're moving in that direction. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and if listeners are taking on other projects, I'm sure everyone's got projects on. And then the climate change, resilience project is no different. Like if they can just think about taking a step and putting a time bound on that step, then that's fabulous. Everyone will be doing something.
Who do you talk to or bring in from the outside to help you? You mentioned a number of experts before that you consult with. Do you have some go-to people yourself? I know you said there's some trodden paths here.
Yeah, so of course this is a multidisciplinary domain, and so you've got the aspects of climate science. I've needed to develop good understanding of that. I had a number of people help me do that. The science team at University of New South Wales have been really helpful in helping me develop that expertise, but also a number of people across the industry. I've had mentors in the emergency management space. I've had a lot of people that have helped me understand community engagement and, how do you have good community programs. I think the important thing is to have or to be getting views from quite a large number of places. I have people that influence my thinking that, might even be climate change deniers, because you understand, why are you thinking that way? What makes you think that way? And it helps you understand the problems from all different kinds of perspectives.
Yeah, I like your response there to sort of have everyone sit at the table so you don't have an echo chamber. So how will we know when we get there? Is there an endpoint to climate resilience or is this an ongoing?
Look, there's no doubt that this is going to be an ongoing challenge. I mean, is if we were able to stabilise the climate, and that's not just about resilience, but about the mitigation of resilience, then we would know we'd got there. We've been talking about the resilience question today, but, the mitigation and creating the more stable environmental, more stable climate for the future is really important. And I think when we are creating solutions that are doing both of those things, then that's really important. And that's one of the things I'm really loving about working at Ausgrid is that we have such a role to play in mitigating climate change. We have the opportunity to be helping the community electrify, reduce their carbon emissions, but also thinking about the resilience question, so tackling the problem from both angles so that you can try and create stability in the system is, I suppose, when you know that you'd get there when those two things equal and balance out.
So this is a long-term transition for Ausgrid. How do you keep people focused on that task? How do you not just focus but motivated, energised?
Yeah. So with my team, I have a multidisciplinary team. And so, I have community engagement people, I have technical people. But very importantly, I have a project manager. And I think that skill set is something that's often overlooked in the climate space. But, having someone that's, here's a milestone, where do we need to be this week? Where do we need to be this hour? Where do we need to be by the end of today or by the end of 3 months' time? And sort of really calling out, well, if we don't get this thing done today, we're not going to be there in, 3 months' time. I think is a really helpful aspect. And I think it's a really important skill to have when you're dealing with a lot of scientists and engineers who can get really caught up in the problem. And that's a great thing because, we need people thinking fully about the problem, but also being practical about implementing and moving forward and knowing that and being very clear and explicit about that. So for people out there, I'd really encourage you to make sure you have a project manager on your team.
How would you describe the culture that you need to make these long-term transitions a success?
Yeah.
And then how do you embed it so that when an individual leaves, the culture remains?
Ausgrid, we're really fortunate that we have a very sort of level-headed culture. So it's an organisation full of, people that think quite systemically. They're very sensible thinkers. And so it's quite an easy set of conditions to actually be very planned in the way you step through the different things that you need to do. So it's a really helpful culture that we have. I think the second part of the question that you've asked is an important one, because how do you build your own team resilience? And one of the points that is something that I'm really focused on, because when you're working in a climate change adaptation team, you can be a very small team. And so if you hold the information tightly within your team, then if somebody leaves, then, you're at risk of losing that information. But what is a better thing to do is if you can work through others in the organisation to really be able to bring them on board and make the climate resilience part of everybody's job. So one of the challenges for me is working out when you're starting to progress, or you're starting to implement something new, when's the right time to actually put that into a business as usual process? Because if you can put it into a business as usual process, then it'll just churn along by itself. Now, if you do that too early, then it's probably going to fall over because it's not quite ready to go into a business as usual process. But if you do it too late, then what you're actually doing is taking up your time doing something that could be done by others. So you're not allowing the team enough room to take on the next thing. So that's, I think, really important thing is how do you actually make climate change resilience like the whole organisation's job and responsibility. And, we're really lucky at Ausgrid in terms of the way that process is set up, and we'll certainly as we go forward this year be learning a lot from the way that they do innovation projects, because they're quite good at actually moving them on to business as usual business processes.
Have you got any tips around that? Because I think that's a general thing that lots of leaders face, right? When do I move it into a BAU and out of a sort of specialist niche?
It's a challenge, right? Because you start something new, it becomes your little baby. And I like to think about it as being just like raising a child. Like it becomes your baby, but at some point you've got to let it go to preschool, and at some point you need to let it go to primary school, and sometime it needs to actually move out of your house. I think as if you're thinking about that at the beginning, is that your goal is to actually allow your baby to become an adult, then you set up the conditions for success. Whereas if you think about it as this thing being, something I love and I enjoy, then you're probably going to be doing it forever. And so I think just being really purposeful about that at the beginning, and helped by your project manager that, will put those phases into the project plan, I think is important.
So everything you've said so far, Penny, has made me feel very comfortable, and I'm feeling very safe that we're in good hands. But I do know that most long-term projects seem to fail. So how are we going to make sure that this one succeeds?
Yeah, I don't know whether failing is the enemy here or whether it's doing nothing. Like if you do nothing, then, that's also a problem. So I think people can stop moving forward because they don't have all the information that, they require to make a decision. And that's not going to be good enough for the future. With failing, it's more a matter of failing quickly. If you put in a solution, you test it, you prototype it and it doesn't work, that's okay, because you need to learn from it and continue to evolve. And so that's why, I was mentioning earlier about the process of like being adaptive and putting in place the checks that allow you to kind of evaluate whether solutions worked or didn't work, and being able to respond to that, because then you'll be continuing to move forward.
Let's just go to, I want to round this out with just a little bit more about you in this role, Head of Climate Resilience. I don't know, 10 years ago, if we would have had a role like that. Would you agree with that as a starting assumption?
I think majority of organisations would not, like 10 years ago, maybe, 5 years ago, people were starting to put in place those types of roles. Yeah.
All right. So if we're on the same page, this is an evolving area and you're at the cutting edge of it. What are your predictions for the future? What are the kinds of roles that we can expect to see in organisations?
Yeah. Look, I expect that everybody will have climate resilience, climate mitigation as part of their roles. Like we've already talked about the ways that and the different contributors that we need to make or to have to solve the problem. So, I think the job that I have is to be able to build the literacy of lots and lots of people. And I think that's the opportunity for organisations like, AGSM. And, some people need to be experts in climate science, and we need those people who are really into the detail. But sometimes we need, people that just go, okay, no, the business case doesn't have a climate resilience contribution. So, go back and work. And that's all they need to know. They need to have the step that just allows them to say, no, go back and do a bit more work. And so different people are playing different, having different contributions. But I think in the future, a role like mine is about facilitating that, but everyone will be playing a part if they're not already.
And imagining some listeners are just sort of embarking on this journey and there's some stuff that just isn't written down, but you know it now. What are those tacit truths for you?
Yeah, when I first started working in the climate science space, I thought that I needed to be, have a PhD in science to be able, to do my type of role. And coming forward a few years, I absolutely have probably more respect than I ever had at that time for the role that the scientists and all the PhDs and, that community do, because it's really invaluable. But being forward a few years, I also understand that there is value in understanding the business problem. So if you only had the science, you wouldn't understand the business problem. How to manage infrastructure or, how do you manage a network of infrastructure? And so, it's really like the confidence of thinking that actually there's not an expert out there that actually understands this whole problem from the perspective that I have. So I can't defer a decision, or I can't defer for one set of guidance from one of these groups. And actually, it's only the organisation that's bringing all of those pieces together, all of the different people that can guide you or provide you advice. That would be the encouragement that I would give.
So your role is really like an integrator.
Yeah, to bring together all the different perspectives and the community's perspectives and values as well, right? Because different people in different places, they want different things for resilience. And so you got to bring all of those viewpoints, the risk tolerance of the board and all of those in order to make your plan. It's not just one entry point.
Businesses need to make big, long-lasting adjustments to adapt to climate change. For Penny, it's about undertaking a huge project one step at a time. But how do you keep a big team focused on the same goal for such a long time? Professor Frederik Anseel believes the psychology of motivation will help leaders succeed. Professor Anseel is the UNSW Business School's Senior Deputy Dean, and is here to give you an insight into how the research going on at UNSW is influencing business practice in real time. But he's also a specialist in organisational psychology himself, and he studies how people and business adapt to change.
If you want to tackle these big, hairy problems, that is not something that you'll be able to solve in a couple of months or even a couple of years. So here's the challenge for any business leader. So you want to go for the big idea, you want to go for the big problem, but that is probably a decade or more that it will take to get there. And so you want to have your whole company, all these teams focused on this big problem, but a lot happens along the way, right? And so how do you keep people motivated working towards that long goal? And so there is some research on that, how you keep people focused. Let's try to unpack that a bit, what would play a role. Let's first talk about purposeful leadership. And so that is almost the easy one, because if you're tackling this big idea, that is extremely motivating purpose. And people that have a higher purpose, that is their why question. Why am I doing this? Why am I getting up every day in the morning, even when I don't feel like it, even when I had a rough night? Why am I getting up? Because there's this big purpose, right? I'm going to save the world. It is climate change. It could be solving inequality. Now, the problem here is with purpose is that a lot of companies have discovered the motivating power of purpose, and now every single company is adopting a big purpose, a higher purpose as the motivational strategy, and that undermines it because it's no longer credible. If everyone is doing it, it is no longer motivating. And so what I would say is, if you're trying to adopt this strategy, you better make sure that it's not lip service, that you're really working towards this bigger goal, and that it is very clear to any employee, any team member in the company, how they are contributing to that bigger goal. And so what we see is basically purposeful leadership only works if there is absolute clarity at all levels how everyone is contributing to that goal. And so you need to make it concrete, right? You need to break it down in small steps, and it needs to be very visible. Another attribute, a characteristic of those leaders is that they understand what deep down sort of makes people tick. And it's something that is not well understood, and I'm always surprised by that, but it is called what one of my Harvard colleagues called the progress principle. So especially if you're on a long-term trajectory, what motivates people is the feeling of making progress towards that ultimate goal. And a lot of leaders forget about that. So they focus on the day-to-day things and they can get stuck into detail. And what happens is that people no longer feel that they're making progress. And so the progress principle basically states that if you can make sure that people every day or every week or every month feel that they have made clear, tangible progress towards a goal, that will be extremely motivating. A third strategy is thinking about, if you're working towards this big, hairy problem, solutions will be messy. Often the problem is messy, ill-defined, and so here's a tricky one. We often say that we like innovation and that we're out there to find solutions and that we want to experiment. And while we all say that, actually all the research shows that people have an implicit, an unconscious bias against novelty, against creativity. We like solutions or ideas that are sort of middle of the road. But if you kill ideas before you've even tested them or explored them or examined them, there might be a risk that you're missing out on that one solution that is able to solve a problem. And so you need to create a culture that is open to novelty, that is open to risk-taking. The challenge here for leaders is to create a culture where people are willing to postpone judgment, right? And that is something that often is called psychological safety. That means that people feel free to speak up, to come up with ideas, crazy ideas, because they know that there will be no interpersonal consequences. They will not be made fun of, they will not be fired, they will not lose out on a great career if they come up with this crazy idea. And so from a psychological perspective, that is probably one of the most challenging things for leaders to do, is create that environment, that climate of psychological safety where people feel free to speak up and come up with crazy ideas.
If you're working on a big, audacious goal like Penny at Ausgrid, keep that purpose front of mind. And if you're leading a team, make sure your purpose is clear and authentic so that other people share your vision and are compelled to stick to it for the long haul. As a business leader, this starts with fostering that psychologically safe environment where a diverse group of thinkers can share their most creative and innovative ideas without fear. And even if the ideas fail, remember Penny's words of wisdom. It all comes down to basic project management. The Business Of podcast is brought to you by the University of New South Wales Business School, produced with Dead Set Studios. To stay up to date with our latest podcasts, as well as the latest insights and thought leadership from the Business School, subscribe to Business Think at businessthink.unsw.edu.au.